In this final episode, we're going to discuss how us parents can educate our children on environmental justice. Learn how to introduce complex topics like inequities in green spaces and pollution through age appropriate conversations. Let's dive in. What is up, everybody? Your host, Devonta Erlinson, back with you all for another environmental communication conversation. I'm super excited and thankful for everybody who's watched these, so thank you. Even if it's just my professor, shout out to you. I appreciate it for pushing me to try something so much different than what I'm used to. I'm totally fine being on camera, I'm totally fine being on the podcast, but talking about a topic that I'm haven't been educated in for the last 7 years, like biomechanics, nutrition, personal training. But I've had this biophilia. Take it back to episode 1. If you haven't listened, go ahead, check out the card up in the corner. You can go check out episode 1. This affinity for nature since I can remember. And then that made me think more about the conversations, how messages were encoded and decoded to me as I grew up. Something from episode 2. So if you missed that, feel free to go back, check out the card above. You can check that out. And it brought me to this place where I'm excited. I'm excited to be doing something different. So thank you to everybody who's been a part of this 3-part series with these environmental communication conversations. Now, in today's episode, we're going to be talking about environmental justice and the importance of fostering empathy and action within our kids. Whenever I think about this, I think about just the injustice I've went through as a young black male here in Minnesota in the United States. When I was 17 years old, I was beaten up pretty bad by the police. I was put in jail for some pretty petty stuff, weed charges and stuff when I was very young. And my mom had to come get me out of there. They actually ended up breaking my wrist and stuff. A whole bunch of crazy stuff happened. Take it back to when I was even younger. I was given more homework in school and everything versus the white kids. All the colored kids got more schoolwork. I've been through a lot of it and work situations, all that. Now, one thing I didn't think about very much was environmental justice until I took this class. And that's why I'm excited to talk about it more. So, what is environmental justice? I'm sure you're wondering. Well, let's define it. These are deeply rooted structural imbalances in society that unfairly places burdens on certain groups of people. And in the context of the environment, this means marginalized communities like low income families or communities of color are often the ones who face the worst environmental conditions. If you look around your cities, you can notice this, right? And my professor said the same thing to me. I started to look around more and I started to notice things. Here in Minnesota, we have the more wealthy cities, Edina, Minnetonka, Maple Grove, these types of places. You start to look what's around them. There's a lot more access to green spaces to some degree, even like rooftop gardens and all that stuff. There's still trees along the streets and everything like that. They also have less proximity to pollution, right? What I mean by this is if you look at by these cities, there's not all these big industrial plants like there are over in Northeast Minneapolis or parts of over in St. Paul on the east side. So there's these little things that you can start to notice within your own community that show this type of environmental injustice in a way and can, I hope, bring forth some type of feeling to figure out how do we create environmental justice, right? And if you want to look into any of this stuff more, I definitely highly suggest looking into Samson's research on green spaces and the disparity, or sorry, the research on green space disparities and their impact on health. Samson goes more in depth on the proximity to pollution, access to green spaces, and climate vulnerability. Really, what it boils down to is what we said there in the beginning, that when you notice the communities that are being affected, it's those low income families, the communities of color, the immigrants, all those communities are the ones who are being affected, not the people at the top of the food chain, as we would see it here in the United States, I guess you could say. Now, that's a pretty big and complex thing. Even us adults, I feel like when we get into conversations about it, it turns into more of an argument than anything else. So, how do we educate our kids on this? That's something I had to rack my brain around a lot before I made this podcast episode. It's something I racked my brain around a lot during the entire 16 weeks of this course and in school, in this class. And something that I think is key, I take it back to episode 2. Again, if you haven't got a chance yet, check it out. But utilizing simple, relatable language to explain systemic problems, right? For my kids, for instance, uh, what I explained to them, for a personal example, exactly what happened with the cops in the way that I might explain it to a friend. No, I'm not going to go into depth about how they beat me up, they bruised me, they broke my wrist, they did all these things. Maybe at some age I definitely will. But with a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old, that conversation's gonna be a lot different. I'm gonna be using more relatable language to explain that to them. Maybe for them, I explain to them more like a movie, one that we've watched where there might be a person who's perceived to be bad, the bad guy, but by the end of the story, you realize that they had their own things going on. And they decided to act in a certain way that hurt somebody else. And maybe that's how I can communicate that to my kids, bringing something relatable that I know they will understand. Kids are really smart. Got to give them more credit. I do myself. And then being able to bring that to a more systemic problem, something that's much larger, something that we might not think they can understand, but doing that will, one, help them understand, and two, I believe they have the capability to understand a lot more than what we give them credit for. I really do. That's why I'm pretty upfront and honest with my kids. So, my oldest, who's 6, about to be 7, we might be having a more real conversation around what I went through, around these environmental injustices that we see. And we do talk about it even. We talk about low income families not having access to some of these things and how we can help out in some type of way, whether that be providing clothes for when it's so cold like it is right now. It's December here in Minnesota currently, and it's freezing cold. It's like negative 30 something wind chill outside. Hey, how can we provide and help out at the community gardens, right? These little things that they start to pick up on at young ages. And we've been able to do that because we just kept it real with them, to be honest. And then we've also just found ways to relate to them and be able to explain these systemic problems and give them the confidence in themselves that they will be able to understand this. I think it's hard because we kind of put all that stuff that we see and how we perceive it onto our kids. But if we take it back to episode 2 again, encoding and decoding, how we're putting out those messages and how our kids are taking them in and perceiving them, well, why not find those ways to inspire them? And I think one of the best ways that we can do that, besides being relatable, is bringing in inspiring stories, people who have been making change in this way, right? So I have some TED Talks that I'd love for all you to go check out. My professor provided these for us. throughout the class, and they're free for you to access too. I'll have them down in the show notes. But these TED Talks bring in a different understanding from people who are leading from the front. You have Dr. Janet Armstrong, who does a talk, and you also have James Sinclair, who does a talk. Amazing, amazing TED Talks, and getting you to see, oh, this is very inspiring from somebody who lives a much different lifestyle, but also is studying this, is leading from the front on how we all can, sorry about that, how we all can go forth and do different, and just perceive this all different and start to understand it from other people's perspectives. I think that's the coolest thing about these TED Talks. And I think the last thing we can do when it comes to educating our kids on these justice issues we see in the environment is just encourage empathy by discussing how issues affect families and communities. Like I was saying with my kids, we just donated stuff, right? There was somebody who had sandals and stuff and didn't have any jacket or anything. And I explained to them what was going on and why I was giving my clothes away. And they offered to give theirs away. As I was saying before my camera died, they offered to give theirs away. And that's huge. I saw that they instantly had empathy because I had that discussion. I was upfront and honest with them. But I also brought in relatable language, right? So those are all big things that we can do. Use simple, relatable language to explain the systemic problems and share inspiring stories from people who are leading the charge from the front. And then just encourage empathy by discussing with them how these issues affect families and communities around you. Now, I'm going to take it back to some class discussions we did to take us out of here for today. I want to highlight something from a discussion we did a couple weeks back. And this is based off this video called Conversation, or this website called Conversation with Earth. Link will be down in the show notes, so feel free to check it out. The question I asked myself was, does the video empower Indigenous communities or tell stories authentically? My answer was, I think the video did a much better job at showing authenticity to their stories, mainly because of the tones and personability of the video. If you go to this website, you'll be able to kind of scroll around a little bit, see exactly what this place is all about and what this website's all about. But I would suggest going to all their video stories and then going through that and just watching and seeing how they put forth the other individuals' communication about Mother Nature and how they live in it and how they perceive it. It's very powerful, and I think they did a very good job at showing the authenticity there uh, of the stories they're portraying. So please check that out if you have the time. I think it would be a benefit to you, your family, for sure. And the last thing I want to tie in is this reflection I had from a reading, and it just talks about change. And I just wrote down a couple ideas and brainstormed words that came to mind while I was reading this. It's a Milston reading, and what I said was strive for change, a dialectic, the push and pull, disassociation, distraction, cover up, misinformation, children. This is where we need to make the change. Fooled. Why did I use these words? Well, that's exactly how I was feeling as I was going through this process, through this discussion project we were doing. I had to go through different websites, different videos, and try to decode, like, hey, okay, what are they trying to portray? How did I, as the consumer, perceive it? What did I get at the end of it? What was the messaging here? What do they want me to do? And from that reading and then taking it back, I was like, wow, like all this environmental justice, injustice, it's a push and pull. Like we have myself included, like I will definitely have this side of me that is pulled toward what's normal in today's society, things that I don't believe are the most beneficial for the long-term health of Mother Earth and us humans. And then I also have a push to do what feels right down deep. And then, of course, there's distractions everywhere, there's cover-ups everywhere, there's misinformation everywhere in our children. It's where it always starts. And that's why I've always taken it back to. And that's why I've based this podcast series from a parent's perspective. Now, anybody who's not a parent, you can take this and use it in your communities. I know there's people who look up to you, so please do so. And to close this series, I really just want to take a moment to go over the themes of the podcast. With episode 1, we talked about biophilia. How, what is that? What is an affinity for nature? Where does it come from? And how do we help our kids develop that affinity for nature? In episode 2, we discussed those conversations, how we communicate, how we encode things for our kids to then decode. Us as parents being the encoders, giving the messages that they perceive. Our kids are then taking them in and decoding them for themselves and then go forth and do what they wish with that. And I hope all of our kids do better than us. And of course, the final episode, this episode, we jumped into environmental justice and how we really talk about these complex topics with our young ones. Again, don't sell them short. I know I've done that to my own kids. Don't do it to yours. They're much, much smarter than what we give them credit for. Now, I would just suggest making it a family project. Maybe, something that we started out doing was grabbing little trash grabbers and walking around the block and picking up any little pieces of trash that we found. Like I brought up the community gardens, right? There's a lot of different things in your community, even just writing letters to local officials about maybe wanting more green spaces for your community. Like you could all do that as a family sitting around the dinner table, and it can be an amazing thing. So my call to action for you all is 1, subscribe. I'm going to be doing more environmental communication conversations. I'm going to try to find people who know a lot more about this stuff than me and bring them in to this dynamic dad life of mine and be able to hear what they have to say, share it all for you all, and give you the ability to take in exactly what I'm taking in. I'm learning as well. So if you liked this podcast series, please do me a favor. Share the podcast with any loved one, anybody you think who could get some type of benefit from it, and suggest maybe a topic for future episodes. If you got any ideas for me, any people I could reach out to, please let me know. That would be absolutely amazing. And I encourage participation in using the hashtag #EcoFamilyJustice. All right. If you want to check out any of the resources, everything will be down below. I definitely want you to all check out the Green Lining Institute. It's a nonprofit organization that advocates for racial and economic justice to combat systemic inequities, including those in environmental access. Perfect for what we talked about today. Without further ado, that's the final episode in this 3-part series on environmental communication conversations. Thank you all for joining me again. I'm your host, Devontae Erlinson, and we'll see you next time.